Police admit they are no closer to finding Laci Peterson than they were on Christmas Eve, the day she vanished.
Laci Denise Peterson is 8 months pregnant. She's considered a high-risk missing person under suspicious circumstances.
A California man is anxiously waiting to hear word on the mysterious Christmas Eve disappearance of his pregnant wife.
He saw her at 9:30 in the morning before he went fishing, and shortly thereafter, she went on her walk. No one has seen her since.
I love my daughter so much. I miss her every minute of every day.
Please, please, please let her go. Bring her back.
We love her so much. Please give her. Let us have her back.
As Christmas celebrations came to an end in Modesto, residents awoke to dreadful news. The Modesto Bee was the first to publish details about Laci's disappearance 2 days before, and as locals collected their newspapers from driveways and porches on the morning of the 26th, word of a pregnant woman vanishing from a local park spread across the city, and hundreds of people in the community responded. Eventually they would help her family and friends to blanket the city with missing posters and scour miles of surrounding ranches, orchards, waterways and parks, in the prolonged and desperate search to find her.
The community mobilized immediately. As soon as Laci disappeared, people were helping to search for her.
When I got there, I was pretty shocked. They already had people making flyers. I mean, they were going door to door. They were in the park.
Laci went missing Christmas Eve. She's 27 years old and she is over 8 months pregnant.
As the days crept by and Laci's story went nationwide, hundreds would swell to thousands, with tips and sightings reported from as far away as New Zealand. People poured into the city from all over the country, most looking to join the search for Laci, while others only came looking for a good story or to gawk at her family. But it was locals who opened their homes and businesses to support the search, sacrificing what they had, great or small, to help bring Laci home. Strangers offered meals for the family, and local businesses like Ditto's provided resources free of charge to help bring one of their own home safe. By the evening of the 26th, 2 donated conference rooms at the Red Lion Hotel began to fill with computers, phones, maps, and people, to accommodate the flood of information coming in. Though not long after, while the conference room at the hotel began to fill with flyers and volunteers, the guest rooms began to fill with Petersons. As the second grueling day searching for Laci came to a fruitless end, Scott and his family found accommodation at the Red Lion Hotel after law enforcement cleared the house on Covina to execute a search warrant. For Scott, the day hadn't started on a high note either. Not only was he no closer to finding his missing wife, with police honing in on him as the most viable suspect, the media had also begun to camp out in front of the house, and he'd received a resignation from one of his employees early that morning. Eric Olson, who'd begun working for Scott as a Trade Corp salesman the previous summer, recently became frustrated with the company, and with Scott Peterson as well. Trade Corp hadn't provided the benefits promised when he was hired, but Eric also took issue with Scott's job performance. He said Scott wasn't getting things done for the company, and accepted a job from Sun West on the 23rd. He didn't want to quit just before Christmas, so he sent his resignation the day after. But just as Scott's poor work performance encouraged Eric's decision to resign, his behavior surrounding Laci's disappearance encouraged a strong reaction from Modesto police, mere hours after she vanished. Detectives have a notoriously low tolerance for both coincidence and deception, and they suspected Scott was concealing the truth from the start. And his coincidental fishing trip in a boat no one knew he owned wasn't exactly leading the police in other directions. Despite discovering a few bits of honesty from him, such as the whereabouts of his missing tennis shoes and the condition of the warehouse lights, police were miles away from trusting Scott. Knowing there had to be more lingering under the surface, they intended to keep digging until they found it. He had his work cut out for him if he was looking to clear his name with detectives, but first, he had his mother to deal with. Scott's parents arrived the day before, just in time to have a holiday dinner with their golden boy. It was implied during the trial that Scott even cooked for his guests on Christmas Day, which upset Sharon even more when she found out. Sharon went without food for several days after her daughter disappeared. However, Scott playing host for the Petersons the previous night was still less distressing for her than Jackie's behavior when she saw her the following day. On the morning of the 26th, Sharon worked hard to subdue her overwhelming grief, dragging herself to Laci's house for updates on the search, when she encountered Jackie. They hugged as soon as they saw each other, but then Jackie began to take off her shoe. With a proud smile, she displayed her freshly painted toes to Sharon, informing her that she'd just had a pedicure. Then Jackie told her she'd had her feet done for Laci, saying she knew she'd get a hard time from her daughter-in-law if her feet looked shabby. Stunned and in a bit of a daze, Sharon glanced down at her own feet. She realized that she'd failed to even match her socks that day. Later, she reflected on the situation, fully grasping that Jackie must have had her feet done after she learned of Laci's disappearance. She and Lee had no plans to visit Modesto until they finally got the call from Scott. Having her feet done for Laci meant she'd had them done after finding out she was missing. For Sharon, it was like a slap in the face, though she was too numb and broken to feel the sting at the time. In the moment, she stared in bewilderment at Jackie's broad smile and her pedicured foot, having no idea how to respond. And as the family made their way to the police station for their first nationally televised interview a few hours later, it would be Brent's turn to be baffled by Jackie's insensitivity and oblivious behavior. They rode together to the police station, and while Brent sat nearly silent, consumed with anxiety over his missing pregnant sister, Jackie chatted him up about her new Jaguar along the way. After completing the interview, Scott, Sharon, Brent, and Jackie gathered with the rest of Laci's loved ones for another press conference. Scott's father Lee was absent, having taken one of his other sons to look for Laci near the foothills of the Sierra Mountains, though his choice of location for the search remains unclear. The press conference was larger this time, with a long table at the front of the room seating nearly 24 of Laci's family and friends. Scott kneeled at the far end of the table, as police fielded questions from the media, until several reporters began to ask about whether they were considering the husband as a suspect. With that, Scott walked out, and it would be the last press conference he would participate in. Once they were done with the reporters, the family met with law enforcement and went over the developments thus far. At the end of the meeting, detectives made it clear they'd had some serious issues with Scott's demeanor, and even more trouble with his trip to Berkeley on Christmas Eve. It was plain to Ron by the time they left, the police thought Scott's fishing story was far too fishy for comfort, and being a man who was known for a direct approach, he took his questions straight to Scott. He told him the detectives had some obvious issues with his alibi and advised him that if there was more truth to be told on the matter, now was the time to come out with it. Knowing there was something more to the story, he asked Scott flat out if he had a girlfriend. Ron offered the opening for him to come clean, warning him that police would discover an affair, sure as spring. Scott denied cheating on Laci, mumbled something about fishing, and walked away. It was the last conversation Ron had with Scott Peterson, aside from a few choice words over the phone weeks later. But there was another man looking for answers from Scott that day as well. Laci's father Dennis paid him a visit that afternoon, in hopes of getting more insight into what may have happened to his little girl and his grandson. The following is a description of the encounter Dennis Rocha had with Scott Peterson on the 26th of December in his own words. My gut instinct told me something wasn't right with Scott, and I'd gone to their home so I could speak man-to-man with him. There were a lot of things that didn't add up. I didn't offer to shake hands with him, and said I wanted to sit down and talk. He kind of shook his head as if he didn't want to face up to the truth. He told me to wait while he finished talking with some other people, and I could tell he didn't want me there. I said I'd wait a few minutes while he finished up, and that's when our eyes met. His piercing stare sent a chill right through me. My heart was pounding and I felt sick to the core. There was absolutely no warmth from him at all, just nothing, no emotion, just emptiness. It was a look of pure evil. He held my gaze for just 2 seconds, then quickly looked away. But it was the longest 2 seconds of my life, and that was enough for me to know what was in his head. He never mentioned Laci's name, and never said he missed her. That afternoon, Scott completed a missing persons interview with Chris Boyer, captain of the search and rescue team at the sheriff's department. During the questioning, Scott said he didn't know exactly what Laci's route was that day, but he recalled that while Mackenzie returned home fairly clean, his leash was dirty. He also told Boyer that she frequently walked in the neighborhood instead of the park, doing so as recently as the 22nd, but she would never go too far from home. And when Scott said she had a habit of leaving the door unlocked, it prompted Boyer to ask about Laci's keys. Scott took them from her purse the night she disappeared to unlock her truck, but he didn't know where they were now. Detective Grogan spoke up, explaining that they'd taken her keys as evidence sometime the day before. Not long after his interview with Boyer, Scott made his way to the warehouse to pick up a specific photo to use for flyers, when he encountered police blocking his way in. He called Detective Grogan. When he took Scott's call, he was with Brocchini in Judge's chambers, waiting for a signature on their search warrant. He explained to Scott that he'd had the warehouse locked down since the night before, and the only reason he hadn't done the same with the house was as a courtesy to the family. But Grogan let him know on this call that they'd planned to do a search of both properties imminently. Scott told him they didn't have to get a warrant, that he would have let them search without it. But apparently, he was only referring to the warehouse, because when it came time to serve the warrant at home, Scott said he wanted to call his attorney. But Scott also told Grogan on that call that he'd begun to have some trust issues with Detective Brocchini. He specifically mentioned the detective leaving his keys in his truck and his notebook in his boat, forgetting them that first night. He insinuated to Grogan that he'd felt like they were forgotten on purpose, though there were no specific allegations made. Just to clarify, Scott was the one to go into the warehouse to retrieve the notebook Brocchini left behind on the boat. The detective was never in the warehouse or near the boat alone. And the keys left in the bed of the truck were retrieved by Brocchini while Scott was within eyeshot of it. Although the detective was certainly able to pocket Scott's gun at some point, without him noticing. The next move for law enforcement was to bring in scent dogs. At 3 p.m. on the 26th, Eloise Anderson and Cindy Valentine arrived on the scene with their trailing dogs. Anderson brought Trimble, a Labrador Retriever, and Valentine brought Merlin, a Bloodhound. The first order of business for Valentine was to find personal items of Laci's, for Merlin to track her scent with. Valentine entered the house, and put on a pair of latex gloves. She collected Laci's pink slipper, and placed it into a plastic bag. But then she picked up Scott's brown slipper, thinking it was also Laci's, while wearing the same gloves. She moved on to retrieve Laci's sunglasses from her purse, and her hairbrush from the bathroom drawer, without changing them. She also proceeded to take Scott's slipper from the scene, even though he told her it wasn't Laci's. Scott actually took a tone with her, as though he was irritated that she had it. Although he might have just been frustrated that they were collecting the wrong items to locate his missing wife. All of the articles, including Scott's brown slipper, were placed in separate plastic bags and taken to her vehicle. Strangely, though she said Scott's slipper was handled and bagged by mistake, the dogs wound up using it during a search on the 4th of January that we'll detail in a moment. The hairbrush and the sunglasses she touched afterwards were also kept to work the dogs during the searches that followed, including the boat ramps at Berkeley Marina. Valentine later recognized cross-contamination as a possible issue, stemming from her mishandling of the articles after the brown slipper. She acknowledged that gloves absorb and transfer scents very quickly and easily, and if she'd been aware the slipper belonged to Scott, she would have changed them after handling it. An ideal scent article would be something handled by Laci exclusively. Though they lived together and their scents would mingle, certain items would have mainly been covered in her scent, especially things Scott hadn't touched frequently or recently. Valentine assumed Laci's sunglasses and her hairbrush would have been ideal, but no one confirmed that Scott hadn't touched them. The problem was that he had touched them even more recently than Laci. Scott had been in her purse to retrieve her keys on the night of the 24th, moving her sunglasses to get them. Additionally, when Valentine layered Scott's slipper scent onto the glasses with her gloves, It may have further muted Laci's scent profile and mixed in even more of Scott's, with the most recent traces on the items now being his. This is important, because their dogs are trained to trail on the freshest scent, which isn't always necessarily the strongest. There was more protection for the scent of the sunglasses themselves, as they were in a hardshell case, which is what Valentine touched when she collected it, and what Scott touched when he got Laci's keys. The dogs were scented with the case open to the actual glasses inside, though the two items were in the same bag at the time. Why all of the dogs weren't simply scented with Laci's uncontaminated pink slipper on all of the searches is unknown, but it ended up only being used with one dog, on one search. But we'll get to that in a little while. For now, let's see where Merlin went when he picked up a scent from the sunglasses in front of the house on Cavina. Valentine scented him by letting him smell the open bag with the glasses, and he picked up on a trail in the street heading north, in the direction of the park. But then he cut left on Edgebrook, and then another left, all the while traveling in the middle of the street, until he reached 1326 Highland. The house sits on the next block over, and their kitty-cornered back lawns would have actually touched one another, if not for the fencing. Merlin led Valentine up the driveway, and into the backyard. He checked the area briefly, but soon turned back the way he came, down the drive and into the street, heading west. Valentine explained that Merlin catching Laci's scent in a back lawn a block away could have been caused by a number of scenarios. Laci could have very well been on that property on Christmas Eve, she could have been there that very day, she could have been there a week ago, she could have walked by and her scent was carried up the driveway, though again, there'd be no way of knowing when. Or, she may not have been there at all. With the close proximity between the Peterson house and the backyard on Highland, the wind could have easily carried Laci's scent from her own property into her back neighbor's lawn, attracting the dog's attention. Again, assuming it was Laci's scent he'd picked up to begin with. When Merlin came off the driveway and focused on the middle of the street again, just as he had when he started in front of the house on Cavina, Valentine suspected he might be picking up the trail from a vehicle. Once he made his way back to Highland, Merlin crossed over Santa Barbara Avenue, continuing west for 30 to 40 yards, before turning around. He trailed back east on Highland, turning south on Santa Barbara this time. After two very long city blocks, Merlin cut southeast, on La Loma Avenue, until he reached Yosemite Boulevard. Once on Yosemite, he turned to the west, sticking to the sidewalk now, and hugging close to the buildings. Once he reached Santa Rosa Avenue he went south, all the way to where the street dead ends. Merlin weaved in and out of a few parking lots, before circling back to the locked gate at the Gallo Winery. E.J. Gallo owns a slew of major labels in the industry, and the massive gated compound at Yosemite Boulevard and Santa Rosa Avenue is comprised of several different buildings, and covers a few square blocks. Although Merlin guided her to the gated entrance of the Gallo parking lot, Valentine testified that he was no longer actively tracking the scent. She sensed that he had lost his connection to the trail, even before they'd reached Yosemite Boulevard. She said her decision to have the gate unlocked and search the lot at the Gallo Winery was not based on Merlin's signals, but rather her own experience in search and rescue, and her desire to satisfy her curiosity. Despite the fact that the dog had ceased tracking, she felt it was necessary to search inside the gate. Police combed the lot, and looked through the dumpsters, though nothing came of it. Valentine and Merlin returned to the house on Cavina, to report back to Detective Brocchini. She knew from her previous briefing that this was not a typical search and rescue operation, understanding right away that a significant objective for the dogs was to associate Laci's scent with the places where Scott had been on the day of her disappearance. Valentine was aware that other search groups had primarily focused on the park, and that the police believed Laci had gone missing while on foot somewhere near there. She informed Brocchini that Merlin was trailing a scent in the street, as it appeared to have originated from a car. At that point, the detective wanted to see if Merlin could find the warehouse. Valentine requested for Brocchini not to reveal the location of the building, but rather, take them to a nearby area that offered multiple directions for the dog to go. Brocchini dropped Merlin and Valentine off a block away from the warehouse. At the intersection of Kansas and Emerald, she used the sunglasses to scent the dog again, and he headed south. He trailed for a couple of blocks, until they arrived at another locked gate, outside of a storage yard. At the fence, Merlin alerted and began to pace, as they tried to get permission from the property owner to search inside, but were unsuccessful. They returned to Brocchini to debrief. After learning Merlin alerted on a property multiple blocks away in the opposite direction, the detective made the decision to take the dog directly to the warehouse, rather than see if he would track a scent there on his own. Once there, Valentine scented Merlin with the glasses again, just outside of his office door. Merlin picked up on a trail, and Brocchini accompanied them as they followed it this time. The dog took them out of the parking lot and onto the sidewalk heading south on Emerald, but he soon returned to the middle of the street, guiding Brocchini and Valentine several blocks further south to Maze Boulevard. Merlin continued following Maze to the west for approximately a quarter of a mile, until the traffic became problematic, causing Brocchini to halt the search. Maze Avenue West transforms into Highway 132, which provides the quickest path from Scott's warehouse to Berkeley Marina. By this point, Valentine was more convinced than ever that Merlin was following a scent that had been left behind by a car. On January 4th, Valentine and Merlin went back to Maze Boulevard, where they'd halted the trail 9 days prior. But this time, Merlin would have a bit of assistance tracking the scent. They used Laci's glasses again, and began at the intersection of Emerald and Maze. Merlin traveled a considerable distance west, before catching a ride to the next junction to see if the trail continued. This method of tracking is called drop trailing. The drop trailing method involves transporting Merlin by car for a certain distance, and then letting him out to search for the scent. If he's successful, they continue driving a few more miles, and allow him to repeat the process. If he's unable to find the scent, they check for a gap in the trail by working the next intersection, or retrace their steps. Merlin drop-trailed west on Maze Boulevard for about 15 more miles, but he had a friend on the trail with him that day. Trimble and her handler Eloise Anderson also started working at the corner of Emerald and Maze, but Trimble was scented with Scott's slipper, rather than something belonging to Laci. Trimble picked up the scent, drop-trailing along the same path Merlin took, west along Highway 132, when both dogs began to work the closed intersection at Highway 33. Officer Rick Applegate was stationed with his patrol car blocking the on-ramp to 132, while Trimble worked Scott's slipper and Merlin worked Laci's sunglasses. Suddenly, Scott pulled up onto the on-ramp, behind the wheel of Laci's Land Rover. Applegate immediately recognized Scott, and began gesturing to him that the road was closed, but there was no reaction. The officer then waved his arms out of the window of his squad car, motioning for him to turn his car around, and Scott still didn't respond. Frustrated, Applegate eventually stepped out of his squad car and approached him. But when he got near the driver's side window, the officer was quite surprised to hear Scott asking him for directions for the quickest way back to Modesto. Applegate told him to turn around and go back the way he came. Law enforcement believed this was a tactic Scott used to throw the scent dogs off the trail, by bringing Laci's vehicle to the area. But it was only Trimble, who'd been scented with Scott's slipper, that took notice of his presence at the intersection. The dog headed directly down the 132 off-ramp to the area where he'd just been, in Laci's truck. Merlin was along the overpass, and though he'd been scented with Laci's glasses, he never took notice of the Land Rover or picked up on any scent coming from it. Once Valentine learned why Trimble went down the ramp, she restarted the dog with Scott's slipper, and caught the trail again at 132 heading west. Merlin and Trimble tracked for another 5 miles or so, until the search was stopped again due to heavy traffic at the 580 freeway, which also happens to be the next leg of the trip to Berkeley Marina. But there was a spot along the highway long before they encountered Scott, where Trimble left the road, following the scent down to the river. She tracked it for 30 to 40 yards along the water, still heading west. Trimble made her way back up to the highway, but the excursion was enough for Valentine to ask Eloise Anderson to bring a cadaver dog to the riverbank. When Anderson finished with Merlin, she retrieved Twist, one of the cadaver dogs she had with her that day, and returned to the area along the San Joaquin River. Anderson gave the dead scent command, and worked the stretch of waterfront, but she never alerted. Twist also failed to alert after checking an area under the Highway 132 bridge, though it's unknown why this location was searched with a cadaver dog. While Merlin and Trimble began to connect Laci's scent to Scott's warehouse, and eventually to the marina at Berkeley, police secured their home at 523 Covina Avenue after a judge signed off on the search warrant. Around 5 o'clock that evening, Scott, his parents, and many of his siblings, were removed from the residence. Seeking out a place to bed down for the night, they headed to the Red Lion Hotel. In our last episode, we heard Scott's father Lee describe the shocking call he'd gotten from his son on Christmas Day. Now, we'll hear his half-sister Susan and his sister-in-law Jamie react to Scott's call the day before.
I figured I could do something. You know, I just needed to be up there with Scott, so I flew out the next morning.
We were standing in our bedroom and I could only hear Joe's end of the conversation. But pretty much all he said is, "I'm coming, brother."
While his siblings flocked to Modesto to support Scott and join the frantic search for their pregnant sister-in-law, Bueller, Burkini, and Grogan were drafting the search warrant to present to the judge. The mops and rags collected on the 24th made for an easy sell. The moment detectives said they suspected Scott cleaned up the crime scene with them, they had their signature. They'd gotten a late start, but by 7:30 that evening they were ready to begin processing the house.
We all headed back to Scott's house. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to start dinner. The detective walks over to me and he sees me putting the lasagna in the kitchen in the oven. And he says, I don't think you're going to need to be doing that. And I go, well, why? We need to eat. And he says, we have a search warrant and we're going to be in here for several hours, maybe in through the night. I thought, wow, really?
Before the search began, Detective Bueller requested a team from the Department of Justice to look for latent prints, wanting to rule out evidence of a home invasion or a possible abduction scenario, but it was never done. Bueller said it was the FBI forensic team making the decisions about when and if they would lift prints, and from what we can tell, none were collected during the search. Scene manager Detective Rudy Schul-Teddy's top priorities for the search were the discovery of blood evidence and documenting signs of a struggle. And because they thought the mops and rags were evidence of a cleanup, much of the testing and examination was done low to the ground. They were checking cracks in the tile, gaps under the quarter round and along the baseboards, the legs and feet of all the tables and beds, and the lower portions of all of the furniture. And knowing Scott was seen vacuuming near the laundry set the day before, they not only collected the bag from Laci's sweeper, they vacuumed the area again, with their own specialized equipment. The FBI forensics team was mainly assigned to work the living room and the laundry area, lending their expertise as needed in other rooms. Between the search of the house that night and Scott's warehouse the following day, technicians removed 60 items of evidence. One of the most noteworthy articles removed from the house might be the comforter from Scott and Laci's master bedroom. Ultimately, other than the spots found on the door of his truck, it would become the only piece of blood evidence in the entire case, though it turned out not to be Laci's. However, there were some interesting things found on the computers, and in the sheds out back as well, including a large blue tarp that had been in Scott's truck the day Laci went missing. On the 27th, their second day processing the search warrant, after spending about 90 minutes working the paths and perimeter of La Loma Park with no results, Anderson brought her cadaver dog Twist to the house on Covina. Twist didn't use scent articles or track over distances. She was trained to find dead scent and utilized strictly for cadaver location. Her walk through the interior was quiet, but outside, in the shed off the patio, she seemed to signal on the blue tarp. She also alerted on a container of fertilizer. Anderson removed the container, because the smell was outside of the dog's training parameters, but Twist went back to the blue tarp on the lawnmower and alerted again. Anderson removed the tarp, noticing it had a brown liquid on it that very distinctly smelled like fertilizer as well. The chemical scent was heavy in the small area, and seemed to be throwing the dog off a bit. Twist then went back inside the shed, got on her hind legs to sniff along the shelving, and alerted again. The shelves had gardening tools such as a chainsaw and pruning shears, but Anderson could not confirm that Twist's alerts weren't due to the fertilizer smell. A third search was conducted with a cadaver dog that day, at Scott's warehouse. But the strong chemical smell of fertilizer was even thicker there, making the dog's behavior unpredictable. Twist roamed the warehouse off-leash for around 45 minutes with no reaction, until Anderson put her in the boat. The dog dropped her head and showed some mild interest, but suddenly seemed unsure of her footing and wanted to get out, which was highly unusual. She got Twist out of the boat, and let her continue to work the area. Twist immediately went to the starboard side of the boat and gave an alert, but she couldn't pinpoint it, failing to drop down on a particular spot. She then nosed around on a shelf right next to the boat, pulling an empty carton of Ziploc bags out of a box, at which point Anderson commanded her to drop it, as she's never allowed to pick anything up while she's on a search. While the dog displayed some portions of her alert, Anderson wasn't convinced that her signals were clear. She wrote in her report that Twist didn't give a true alert at all that day, noting that the dog never downed on an area in response to her dead scent command. She concluded that Twist's behavior wasn't consistent with her training, and seemed to possibly be influenced by the fertilizer in both areas. But investigators believe they'd found another key piece of evidence while processing the warehouse. On a flatbed trailer Scott used for work, they documented an area covered in cement powder. Scott told them previously that the mess on the trailer was left there after he'd made an anchor for his new boat, and while his story seemed sensible on the surface, police thought the evidence told a far darker story. Detectives determined they could plainly see multiple circular outlines in the powder, raising their suspicions that Scott made several anchors in that spot, not just one. They'd also discovered his recent purchase of a very large bag of cement, far more than he'd ever need to make a single anchor. But the clue that solidified their dark theory had to do with the one he'd made for certain, that was still in the boat. When they noticed that it not only had no rope tied to it, but there was no rope in the boat at all, they expanded on their speculation about the possibility of other anchors. They theorized about what he may have used them for, and where they were now. Ultimately, they concluded the rest of them were most likely with his missing wife, at the bottom of the San Francisco Bay. For detectives, the dots were connecting to create a gruesome outline of Laci Peterson's fate, and they were anxious to gather everything they could find to complete the grisly picture. They left no stone unturned during the search of the house, taking everything that might have a hint of evidentiary value. Along with the blue tarp in the shed, police took the computers from both the house and the warehouse, and a large binder of financial records from the spare bedroom. They also took the 3 patio umbrellas Scott drove to Berkeley and back and his boat cover, even though he hadn't used it that day. Part of the reason they may have been more interested in the boat cover was that it had gas spilled on it. When they found it in the shed, it was under a leaky leaf blower, and they hung it over the fence to dry. During the opening statements at the trial, the prosecutor claimed that Scott intentionally poured the gas on the boat cover, and did the same with the fertilizer on the tarp, because both of those things will degrade DNA evidence and biological material, not to mention confusing the scent dogs. But they never brought on any experts to discuss the impact gasoline or fertilizer might have on blood or DNA, and there was no biological material found on the items, degraded or otherwise. While police removed dozens of small articles from the house during the 2-day search, they'd seized a few big-ticket items as well, including both vehicles, and of course, they took the boat. While Scott spent the next couple days at the Red Lion Hotel, the remainder of his family, including his parents, would find themselves there for quite some time after, much to the annoyance of Jackie. As the Petersons checked in and settled on one of the upper floors, Sharon met with Kim Peterson for the first time, in the conference room downstairs. The area would become known throughout the community as the Volunteer Center, and as the house was no longer an option for a base of operations, the timing for the donation of the space couldn't have been better. While the police had a mobile command post already established in the park, and an investigation center set up at the police station, the volunteer center at the hotel became a hub for information and resources for civilian searchers. As the hunt for Laci wore on, and the entire back wall of the volunteer center became covered in photos of his missing sister, Laci's older brother Brent had a large hand in organizing many of the searches for her. Brent's co-workers generously covered his job responsibilities and donated their days off, so he was able to focus on trying to find his sister. They would do the same for him again 18 months later, so Brent could testify against Scott during his trial in Redwood City. The family spent countless hours at the Red Lion, distributing maps to guide the searches, restocking flyers and buttons to distribute in the city, and getting updates on leads and sightings that were now flooding in 24 hours a day on the tip line. But the media began to flock to the Red Lion as well, and Kim Peterson gave the family some advice early on about how to deal with them, though Scott's relationship with the press was already festering by the time he heard it. Kim arrived back home from her family Christmas in Los Angeles and headed straight to the Red Lion Hotel to meet with Sharon, but she'd increased the reward money for Laci by $25,000 before she'd even left LA. The family'd already accumulated $100,000 for the reward fund, and with the extra from Kim and the Carol Sund Foundation, the reward for Laci grew to $125,000 in the first 24 hours. Kim's advice to the family about the press was both realistic and logical. They gathered for a family meeting as she explained the importance of using the media to their advantage and the risks of stonewalling them. Kim knew that their cameras were the best tool available to plead for Laci's safe return and spread the word about her disappearance. Sharon was already a bit miffed with the media, having her photo taken the previous day at the police station. Her cousin Gwen had to get testy when a photographer wouldn't back off. Kim told everyone close to Laci that the press was just something they would have to deal with, advising them to view it as a tool and a necessary evil, though she couldn't have known just how explosive things were about to get. She'd also encouraged the family to choose a spokesperson, explaining that it was best to keep the media informed themselves, otherwise, reporters would seek out other sources for their stories, whether they were accurate or not. Kim needed someone to be the face of the family for Laci, but at the time, Sharon was in no condition to do it herself, and Scott seemed repelled by the idea. He'd already made it clear to Laci's friends to keep him out of the photos being distributed to the media, and now, he told both families that he wasn't interested in speaking to the press, because he didn't want to become the focus of the story. He said he knew it would inevitably wind up with an emphasis on him. He would continue to avoid reporters, and began hiding as much of his face from their cameras as he could, wearing hats and sunglasses whenever he left the house. Scott's response to the press was in stark contrast to the advice Kim gave them, and he would soon realize that the media firestorm was just heating up. After some discussion amongst the family, and Scott's commitment to staying out of the spotlight at all costs, his half-sister Susan Caudillo volunteered to be their spokesman, though that didn't last long. After the first day or two, Sharon made the decision to step in and take over as the spokesperson. She felt that Susan didn't express the emotion or urgency they needed to convey to the public, saying she spoke about Laci as if she were talking about a stranger. Knowing her daughter needed her voice, she drew on strength and determination from her and began to engage with the media herself.
We've been through so much these last days that I'd like to make a plea to the person or persons who have my daughter. Please bring our daughter home.
However, Scott continued with the opposite approach, doing all he could to avoid them. In fact, as the press began to make daily appearances at the volunteer center, he decided to ban them from coming in while he was there. Scott would generally arrive at 7 o'clock every morning, but he wouldn't allow the media to come in until after 9:30, when he would leave to hang flyers. Fortunately, none of the drama playing out behind the scenes between Scott, the police, and the media did anything to slow the momentum to find Laci, at least not right away. Aside from the thousands of volunteers searching areas all over the city, authorities were trying to be as thorough as possible, including several new locations in the search. Modesto utility workers checked dozens of manholes and storm drains around town, and the pond in the park was inspected by divers. Another boat was also run along the creek by the fire department, from the bridge to the Fisherman's Club, but no trace of Laci'd been found. As the sun began to set that evening, Sharon was utterly dejected. But what she didn't know was that a potentially huge break in the case was playing out right across the street from Laci's house that might finally lead them to some answers. Susan Medina and her husband Rodolfo also celebrated the holiday with family in Los Angeles, returning home in the late afternoon on the 26th. They began to see police and media while still several blocks away from their neighborhood, and wondered what was going on. A few minutes later, when they had to show ID at a police barricade and struggled to travel down their normally quiet street, now lined with police cars and media trucks, they knew whatever it was must have happened close to home. As stunned as they were to find their neighborhood in such chaos, they were even more disturbed to learn that their house had been burglarized while they were out of town over Christmas. They didn't have to go far to report the break-in, as there were a handful of patrol officers just across the street preparing to search Scott and Laci's house. Officer Wen took a report from Susan and Rodolfo that detailed the property damage and an itemized list of the valuables stolen, but the bad fortune for the Medinas became a beacon of hope for Laci's loved ones. We'll go over the details surrounding the burglary in a later episode, but for now we'll focus on the family's reaction to the news and briefly discuss the conclusion of the Modesto PD after their investigation. The moment Sharon heard about the Medina burglary, she called the police station, begging for any information they could give her about what happened, and more importantly, when. It was a dead end, with law enforcement unwilling to share anything about an ongoing investigation. But Sharon heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Diane Jackson had witnessed the crime, and she tracked down her phone number that very night. With a renewed sense of optimism at the first bit of good news she'd had in 2 days, Sharon immediately called Diane, and her conviction only grew stronger after speaking with her. Sharon was encouraged by Diane's certainty about what she saw and when she saw it, but she was even more excited to get some details that they could use in their search for Laci. Diane told Sharon she'd seen a white or cream-colored van in front of the Medinas a little after 11 on the morning of the 24th. Armed with that information, Sharon and around a dozen others set out on a mission. They searched the entire city, writing down the tag number for every white or cream-colored van they spotted, turning over hundreds of plate numbers to the Modesto Police Department in a matter of days. Though it would turn out to be for nothing. On the 3rd of January, when police announced that the burglary wasn't connected to Laci's disappearance, her family was back at square one. But on the 27th, as Sharon and the family scoured the city for the light-colored van, Police Chief Roy Waston went on Good Morning America with Laci's story, and a photo of her spectacular smile. His appearance on the show began a snowball effect, and with other media outlets jumping on the story, Laci Peterson's name spread like wildfire. Sharon would later try to explain the incredible fixation that grew around Laci and her family.
Why do you think this story, the story of Laci, captured so much public attention?
I asked that question all along myself. I'm not really quite sure. We've been told many of the letters and cards that we've received from people just say that she's like their sister, their daughter, the girl next door. And it just makes them think of their own family.
It's true. I mean, you see that photograph and other pictures, Sharon, and she just is, her smile lights up the photo as it must have lit up a room, right?
Right, absolutely.
And there was something I think that people felt drawn to, and in some ways she did seem like the all-American girl, and you all seemed like the all-American family in so many ways.
Right, we're no different than anybody else.
As the attention from the media dramatically increased, the number of searchers and volunteers swelled tremendously, and the influx of support did a great deal to lift the family's spirits after the disappointing dead end with the Medina burglary. And when they met with Kim Peterson again on the afternoon of the 27th, they were even more inspired. She was excited to share the news about a very generous donation from an anonymous friend. Someone that they knew who described themselves as a family friend who wished to remain unnamed, contacted Kim that morning with a $375,000 donation to increase the reward fund for Laci. It brought the total reward up to $500,000. That's the equivalent of nearly $825,000 today, and the family was beyond appreciative to the donor.
The people who recognized Laci, the reward is $500,000. Take the money, bring my daughter back safe, and take the money and go and get away free. Get out of here. Just go with the money. Take the reward and go. Thank you. Okay.
Sir, could you say your name one more time, please?
Rocha.
While the remainder of the family discussed the prospect of drawing out a greedy criminal with the increased reward, Scott was sliding farther under the microscope of detectives, who thought they may already have their suspect. But Scott wasn't oblivious to the way the tide was shifting, and by the end of the day on the 27th, he'd hired attorney Kirk McAllister. Initially, McAllister's focus was simply to protect his rights and attempt to keep him from making himself look even more guilty. Though after just a couple of weeks on the job, the latter would prove to be an impossible task. McAllister must have been either up for a challenge or a sucker for punishment, as he continued to serve as Scott's main counsel, until Mark Garagos took over the case for the trial in the summer of 2004. Shortly after Kim told the family about the increased reward money, they announced the news during another press conference, along with updates on the search for Laci, but Scott didn't attend. His absence didn't go unnoticed, and reporters began to barrage Public Relations Officer Doug Redenor with questions about Scott's possible involvement. Redenor would only confirm that he wasn't being viewed as a suspect, and wouldn't comment on it further. But the family was far more outspoken in his defense, consistently reminding the media that it would be incomprehensible for Scott to harm Laci, and that if they knew him, they would agree. Sharon seemed to be his biggest protector, probably because she found herself facing the media more often as their spokesperson, and while privately, she and the family had questions, it would still be weeks before she gave any sign of doubt publicly, and it would take something extreme to cause her to outright accuse him. But police and other onlookers such as Kim Peterson were more objective. During one of the many carry-ins of donated meals sent to the volunteer center, Kim watched Scott make himself a plate of food, picking and choosing what to try and what to leave. Kim said it shocked her a bit, because she'd seen many people unable to make those types of simple decisions for months after the stress of a trauma so great. Sharon decided it was time to get Scott to answer some questions. Sometime on the 27th, his sister Susan asked the family to gather at the center for a meeting. While they were waiting for everyone to arrive, Sharon noticed him standing alone near the doorway of an empty room, and grabbed him by the arm. She pulled him inside, shut the door, and asked him, "What were you doing when you last saw Laci?" It would turn out to be the only question she had a chance to ask before they were interrupted, and his answer only made her more suspicious. He grinned and told her how cute Laci looked sitting on the bench in the bathroom just before he left, doing her hair like Amy'd had at the salon the night before. As far as Sharon knew, it wasn't Laci who'd had her hair done at Salon on the 23rd, it was Scott, and while she made a note to herself to confirm his story with Amy, she also recalled that she'd never seen a bench in their bathroom, or anywhere else in the house for that matter. As she tried to process what he was telling her, there was a knock on the door from Susan, saying that it was time to start the meeting. Sharon and Scott ignored it for a few more moments, until Susan insisted firmly from the other side of the door, that they must get started. Sharon was disappointed that she'd run out of time to ask more questions, and though she would make a few different plans to spend time with him after this, they all fell through. She eventually confirmed that Amy did do Laci's hair at the salon, and although Amy didn't know anything about the bench either, it was plainly in the bathroom, with her straightener still on the counter in the crime scene photos taken on the night of the 24th. It could have been moved by the time Sharon walked through the house on the 25th, but by this point, she'd gotten past the possible lies about the bench, and Amy doing Laci's hair, but began to question why in the world she would be styling her hair, just to go out for a walk with the dog. A few days later, when Sharon finally got another moment alone with Scott behind closed doors, the encounter would be far less tame. It would also be their last. And the meeting Susan was so eager to get on with that she'd interrupted them, would only serve to get Sharon agitated, with Scott and his sister both. Susan printed some information from the Polyclass Foundation, and wanted to distribute the papers to the family. It was a 7-day plan to organize and search for a missing person. But when Susan passed out the materials she'd brought for everyone, Sharon said it was all just redundant. They already had the attention of the national media, an established volunteer center, and help from Kim and her foundation. She saw Susan's meeting as a waste of time. But then Scott chimed in with a strategy to find Laci that made her even more frustrated. He announced that he hired a dog psychic for Mackenzie. He had her scheduled to fly in the next day and had plans to put the psychic up in a hotel, all on the family dime. Sharon heard enough. She snapped at Scott to call it off. She thought the idea was absolutely ridiculous, and she didn't attempt to hide her feelings. No one protested or argued with her, they wouldn't have dared after the tone she took. The following day, police decided to do some more work with the trailing dogs, looking to complete Laci's path from the warehouse to the Marina. But it wasn't feasible to check the entire route from where they stopped the trail at the freeway, so they drove Trimble directly to Berkeley, having her work the entrance, exits, and boat launch. On the 28th, Eloise Anderson arrived at the parking lot near the public boat ramps with Trimble, and sent her with Laci's sunglasses. They checked both lanes leading to the launch area, with no response from the dog. But Anderson walked her a little further toward the restrooms, and Trimble caught a scent. She led Eloise past the restrooms, to a pylon on the pier where visitors can tie up their boats, and signaled the end of the trail. But Captain Chris Boyer had another dog team sent to Berkeley that day as well. Ron Seitz and his Shepherd mix TJ worked the same area where Trimble found a scent, but TJ didn't find anything at all. The only variable that significantly differed during their searches was the item used to scent the dogs. Trimble was scented with Laci's sunglasses, and TJ was scented with her pink slipper. There were 2 water cadaver dog teams brought out that day as well. They were dispatched on boats with their handlers, checking for dead scent around the coastline, but neither of them alerted. The only dog searches the judge allowed into the trial were the 2 completed by Eloise Anderson and Ronald Zeitz, at Berkeley Marina. Anderson and Trimble testified for the prosecution, and Ronald and TJ for the defense, although the jury also heard Anderson's report, detailing Twist's odd behavior with the tarp in the boat. On the morning of the 29th, Ron and Sharon met with Craig Grogan and John Buehler for their first official interview. The detectives had some disturbing articles that had been collected from their searches so far, and they wanted to know if they could identify them as Laci's. Fortunately, Ron and Sharon went through the interview together. The first item was a ripped pair of panties. It's unknown if Sharon was able to say if they were her daughters or not, though they were fairly confident the frayed jacket they showed them next wasn't hers. But the last item from the search gave Sharon a small spark of hope. It was a colorful dress that she thought looked very similar to an old Halloween costume Laci owned. She was anxious to get home and find the picture of her wearing it to see if it was a match. But Buehler and Grogan wanted to know more about the family, and Laci's history with Scott. They discussed their relationship since they'd met at Cal Poly, but as Ron and Sharon rattled off everything they could recall about their spunky cheerful daughter, they realized just how little they really knew about Scott. Of course, they were acquainted with his parents, knew what he did for a living and that he liked golf, but they didn't have much detail when it came to really knowing him, or who he was as a person. Sharon said he'd never been much of a talker, but seemed to be a very attentive listener, and as we heard from Ann Bird, this might have been what made he and Laci such a good match. But his quiet demeanor over the years left Ron and Sharon with a very short list of details about him to share with detectives. Their interview was interrupted by the daily press conference, but when they returned, and their queries about Scott resumed, Buehler presented them with a question that made their heads spin. He wanted to know if Scott had a diploma, and Sharon answered with an easy yes. She knew he'd graduated from Cal Poly the semester after Laci, and that he'd earned a degree in agricultural business. But then, Buehler asked if he had any other diplomas, from any other schools, and Sharon was confused. She said no, that he didn't as far as they knew, but then she wanted to know what he was on about and asked him, "Does Scott have another diploma?" The detective didn't answer, but instead said, "Well, we're asking you." After the interview, Sharon scrambled home, found a picture of the costume, and sent it to the detectives, full of hope that it might lead to something, but they said it wasn't a match. That evening, Sharon's good friend Lissa was at the house with Scott, going through pictures to send to the media. As he thumbed through the photos, he held one of them up laughing and said, "Let's send him this one." The picture was of himself, well, of his hindquarters anyway. It was a photo from his bachelor party, showing his buns as he mooned the camera. He must have been in a mood that day, because his next choice was only slightly less inappropriate. It was a photo of Laci in a bikini, and he made a comment about it getting people's attention, before moving on. But it was the third photo Lissa told Sharon about, that seems to have been the last straw for her. It was a picture of Laci during the cooking course she took in Italy. Lissa said Scott stared at it for a few seconds, and then said how much he missed her pasta. Sharon had yet to hear him say he missed her, cry over her absence, or fret over finding her, but he missed her pasta? It was all just too much. Her heartbreak was morphing into anger, and Scott continued to stomp on every frayed nerve she had. With the dog psychic thing still fresh on her mind, and the weird diploma question from Buehler, she found herself in desperate need of an outlet, and fast. But Sharon's friends already had a plan set in motion to try to take her mind off of her suffering. They'd asked her to dinner, hoping it would provide a distraction. Even if it was just for a short while, they knew she badly needed it. But after they'd finally convinced her to go to dinner with them that night, it was clear to Patty and Lissa when they pulled up outside of the restaurant, Sharon needed advice, and a safe place to vent more than anything else. They prepared themselves for a bombshell when she made them all promise that what she was about to tell them would never leave the car they were sitting in. Once they agreed, she simply said, "Something's not right about Scott." Then she opened the floodgates, and every suspicious thing she'd heard and seen from him since her daughter went missing came gushing out. From his delay in calling her after coming home to find the house dark and unlocked, with Mackenzie still on his leash, to his fishy trip to Berkeley in a boat no one knew he owned. And then there were her doubts about Laci's walk. Why would she have gone to the park in the cold without her phone? Especially after her dizzy spells the month before. And now she was supposed to believe she'd done her hair before she left. But the worst of it was that through it all, Scott seemed cool as a cucumber. There were no breakdowns, no fits of despair or even anger, and no sleepless nights agonizing over the nightmarish places his wife could be. And then there was the dog psychic thing. She hadn't mentioned that to Patty and Lissa yet, but she started in with the story, telling them, "I couldn't believe what I was hearing when he said he'd hired a dog psychic. What's up with that? Why would he hire a dog psychic? Did he really think Mackenzie would learn to speak and tell him where Laci is?" When she looked over at them after her rant, they were stunned, finding the idea just as ludicrous as she did. But when Sharon finally settled and Patty checked her watch, an hour had gone by, and by the end of it, none of them were ready to consider that Scott would ever be able to hurt Laci, least of all Sharon. She couldn't bring herself to contemplate it, and began to feel guilty for thinking he was involved. She filled her mind with how loving they were together, and how much Laci cherished him, pushing the dark considerations out of her head. Sharon often considered how awful she'd feel if she'd suspected him of such an atrocious thing and turned out to be wrong. She imagined Laci coming home, only to be angry with her for accusing her husband, whom she adored so much, of being a monster.
It's sort of interesting in the book. You write about how even in the first days after she disappeared, when you were suspicious of Scott, you felt bad because you thought, if Laci comes home and knows that I suspected her husband.
Right. And I can't really say that it was like a major suspicion. I think a lot of it was subconscious at first, and then as time went on, as the days passed, I just became more and more aware of how unusual I thought his behavior was. He didn't react like so many of us were. The panic, the need to find her immediately. I never once heard him say, and I felt he would have said this to me. We were always very close, but say, "Mom, I don't know, why would anybody take Laci? Where could she be? What has happened to her?" I've never heard him say anything like that. And I don't know if anybody he has said it to.
Today, how are you remembering your wife and your son?
That's very personal. I continue to look for, obviously, times when it's difficult to go on, obviously. So thanks very much.
None of it felt right. None of it felt like this was a man who's being truthful.
Sharon wasn't blind and she wasn't stupid. It was torturous for her to go back and forth in her mind with such a terrible consideration. She was tormented by the entire nightmare, and living through it would eventually cause her to wonder if she was literally losing her mind. While she'd calmed her nerves a bit by finally vocalizing her concerns about Scott to her friends, Sharon was still struggling to suppress the horrifying thought that she might never see Laci again, and that her own husband might be responsible for her demise. But publicly, she didn't utter a word against him. At this point, she hadn't even told Ron she suspected Scott could be involved. The following day, December 30th, divers began searching the San Francisco Bay. The endeavor to find Laci in the water would eventually expand to include the Coast Guard, Navy, and several search and rescue agencies from neighboring counties along the coast. On New Year's Eve, over 1,500 people gathered in the park near Laci's home, not to search for her, but to remind the community, and the rest of the world, that they weren't going to give up until they brought her home. But as the family took the stage, Scott wasn't around, and not wanting to start without him, Sharon asked his sister Susan to track him down. But when she did, he said it was too difficult to go up in front of all of those people, and to go ahead and begin. Brent called him a few minutes later and reported back that Scott preferred to stay in the crowd with his friends.
A candlelight vigil is set for 4:30 this afternoon at the park near Laci's home.
I'm Laci's mother-in-law and Scott's mother, and I want to thank all of you for the love and outpouring. We all love Laci. Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out there tonight. Laci would be so happy to see she had so many friends and supporters. And just keep looking for Laci. Please don't give up.
It was a very emotional event, for the family certainly, but for the rest of the attendees as well. People lit candles for Laci, and linked arms as they sang and prayed. A good many people wept. As Sharon made her way to the microphone, she recalled looking out at the sea of 1,000 twinkling lights shining for her daughter. It was so moving, she was nearly overwhelmed, barely able to talk, and on the verge of tears as she spoke about Laci. Afterward, Dennis walked through the crowd, personally thanking people for supporting the family. Neither Dennis nor Sharon saw Scott at the vigil that evening, but a few well-placed photographers certainly did. The photos they took that night sent the millions who saw them on the news the next day into a frenzy. People were incredulous over his smile, seeing it as a sure sign of his guilt and callousness. But the reaction to his out-of-place smiles at the vigil would pale in comparison to the madness that ensued when the public learned what else Scott had been up to that evening. Sharon knew the vigil wasn't intended to be a memorial. They were still clinging to every thread of hope they had of finding her safe, but as she left the crowd that evening, she experienced a watershed moment, feeling for the first time that Laci wasn't coming home alive. Everyone gathered at the house on Covina for dinner after the vigil, where Sharon became even more upset with the Petersons. Scott served wine from a decanter and behaved like he was hosting a party, while his parents followed suit, with Lee telling jokes, much to Jackie's amusement. But when Scott made a comment about how upset Laci would have been to see all of their coats piled onto her white sitting room chairs, Sharon became extremely upset. When he smiled at her as though he were getting away with something, gestured to the chairs, and told her Laci would be really mad if she saw that, Sharon felt a pit grow in her stomach, and a flash of anger warmed her face. She believed that if Scott truly cared for Laci and expected her home any moment, he would have gotten off his butt and moved those darn coats. Though she expressed her feelings with more forceful language in her book. She didn't say anything to Scott at the time, but went home shortly after, arranging for Lissa to meet her there. They sat up all night that night, making a pros and cons list about Scott. The more of his bizarre behavior she saw, the more she suspected his guilt, but she couldn't come to terms with the Scott she knew, ever harming anyone, least of all Laci. She knew he loved her, there was no doubt in her mind, but his actions conflicted with his words. And although he said he was focused on finding her, hung flyers daily, and told people he wanted and needed her back home, to Sharon, it was all rather shallow. He didn't convey the desperation or urgency she saw in herself, or the rest of the family. As she sat there with Lissa and went over the multiple lists they'd made overnight, they came to a shared conclusion. They both agreed that there was just no way Scott could have been involved, he simply wasn't capable of such a thing. He'd always treated Laci so well, they couldn't imagine him being violent with her. But when Lissa went home, leaving Sharon alone with her lists of doubts about Scott, all laid out in black and white in front of her, she put her face in her hands, and broke down in tears. She felt like she'd been lying to herself, and blinded by her emotions, she'd overlooked the obvious because of the pain it caused her to consider it. But as another day dawned without her daughter, and her suspicions lay displayed on the table in front of her, she told herself out loud. Scott knew, Laci wasn't coming home. If he thought she were, he would have moved those coats. But she would keep those thoughts very private for a long while after, continuing to defend him in the media, only ever carefully sharing her honest feelings with those closest to her. But she did begin actively pursuing more answers out of him, and she tried to arrange for a time they could get together and talk. The only moment alone she'd had with him since Laci'd gone missing had been just before the dog psychic meeting, and that hadn't precisely ended well. She'd called him the day after that meeting to tell him she'd found the charger for their video camera. They set a time for him to stop over and pick it up, but he never showed. And they'd already had a date scheduled to get together the next day, to watch Scott and Laci's wedding video. But he called to reschedule that as well. When she finally did run into him at the volunteer center on the 1st of January, she was ready and determined to find out exactly what happened to her daughter on Christmas Eve. Catching him in between other conversations, she again took him by the arm and led him away into another empty room, but now she had a bit more time, and she didn't intend to waste any of it, but Sharon still took a moment to hug him before she began asking her questions. He hugged her back this time, and they sat down to talk. She still had compassion for Scott, and was unable to simply switch off her love for him, even though her suspicions were growing darker every day. She started by asking him about Christmas Eve morning. She needed him to tell her what Laci was like that day. Was anything different about her? Was she acting strangely? How did she look? Could he tell if she felt all right? And she asked again about what they did that morning, and their plans for the day. He said Laci was fine, just like her normal cheerful self, and that she was excited about hosting brunch. Then he gave her the same timeline, details, and plans that he'd told her before. From having breakfast together, to him coming home to find her not there 7 hours later, and the call he'd made to Sharon looking for her. When he finished, she looked him in the eyes and asked him, "So, then when did you buy a boat?" He smiled and said, "A couple weeks ago." She wanted to know why he hadn't mentioned it to anyone, especially Ron. Scott knew he was a fisherman, and she'd also recalled they'd actually had a conversation together about fishing not long ago. As they all sat around Laci's dining table, eating frozen lasagna because Scott was too late getting home to make the real thing as planned, Ron went on about the day's catch at his fishing hole in Oakdale, as he often did. But Sharon remembered it vividly. Ron had taken her fishing with him that morning, which was a rare occasion, and they talked and laughed about it at length that night. But even more unforgettable was the conversation she had with Laci after dinner. As she sat with her hand on her daughter's stomach, trying to feel little Connor wiggle or move, Laci leaned over and told her about Scott's reluctance to feel the baby kick. Her words would haunt her for years after, as Sharon held on to that memory as the last time she ever touched her daughter. That was on the 15th of December, the last time Sharon spoke with Laci in person, and Scott had every reason to mention the boat he'd bought less than a week before, but he didn't, and she wanted to know why. He told her he was waiting for Christmas to tell Ron about the boat, but it was clear that it wasn't his intention to give it to him as a gift, apparently just to surprise him by telling him he bought it. But this doesn't make much sense. Scott had only ever been fishing with Ron once before, in the 2 years they'd been in Modesto, and he said Scott wasn't much of a fisherman, though other witnesses, mostly his dad and his brothers, would disagree with that later. For Ron, it was one of the things that shocked him about Scott buying a boat, and taking a fishing trip to Berkeley to begin with. Ron said on the one fishing trip they did take, Scott showed his inexperience, and left a brand new pole in their garage. Ron reminded him to grab it before he left that day, but he didn't take it, and never came back for it either. It stayed in their garage even as he and Sharon attended Scott's trial. But whether Scott was an avid fisherman or not, it must have been a strange thing for Sharon to hear him tell her that his boat was actually some sort of Christmas surprise for Ron. She didn't elaborate on his thinking, but did say he was back to giving her short, direct answers, and not offering much for details. Maybe he didn't explain and she didn't ask, but once the topic of conversation turned to the police, Scott suddenly became more talkative, and had plenty of details to share. He told Sharon about Brokini forgetting his things, saying that he'd created an excuse to go back to his truck and the boat on the 24th. But when he put his hands out, showing her how the detectives inspected them earlier, she'd noticed a thin scrape across all 4 of his knuckles, that looked to be nearly healed. She moved on to ask him why he'd been avoiding the press, and he again told her that he didn't want to become the center of things. He felt that the moment he put himself in front of the cameras, the focus would shift from Laci to him, and he wanted to avoid that. He told her that if the attention on Laci began to lessen, he would be willing to put himself in the limelight at that point, to keep the search for her relevant in the media, but until that was necessary, he didn't want any part of it. At this point in the conversation, Sharon shifted gears in a big way. She began to explain to Scott what she would very much like to do to the person who'd harmed her daughter, whoever that may be. She raised her hand in the air, as though she were gripping a knife, and detailed the pieces she would take from one side, before going to work with it on the other. But his response to her grisly description was nearly as out of place as her inclination toward violence. In what must have been an absolutely heartbreaking and terrifying scene, Scott grinned at her and watched, while she motioned with the invisible knife, cutting and slicing at an imaginary monster. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you enjoy the content and want to hear more stories like this one, please consider supporting the channel with the super thanks button below, or visiting our Patreon page linked in the description, and of course, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for your support. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.